For more than a year and a half, Russia was on the offensive. It was slow, and it was plotting. It was hard to observe when watching territorial exchanges from afar. But the accumulation of all of those months of advances eventually made a noticeable difference to the shape of the front line. Then something happened in March of this year. The net gains just stopped. Russia continued to advance in some areas, but Ukraine more than countered back elsewhere. A net 34 square kilometers in March, 119 square kilometers in April, and a tentative 259 square kilometers in May. It is getting to the point that I might have to completely reconfigure this slide. This is no longer noise. Something has actually changed. The question is what? Well, today's video is our search for answers. We will begin with some further confirmation that this is actually happening, despite contrarian takes that miss the forest through the trees. Then I will cover 8 big changes that have happened on the battlefield, which are too numerous for me to type out on screen. But they are the weather, deforestation, Starlink, Telegram, railway strikes, strikes to Russia's defense industrial base, oil strikes, and higher attrition rates. Then I will finish with some comments about where this might be going in the next few months. But let's start with that note about this being a real effect. You have probably seen criticism of figures like this before. Something along the lines of, no, Ukraine is not actually gaining ground. The counterattacks are targeting Russian advances into the gray zone, where they never actually establish control. It's all meaningless. Let's move along. Okay, I have no problem with the premise of this point, because it reflects the realities of the modern battlefield. Drones cause no man's land to run kilometers deep, and more than 10 kilometers in some areas. Russia advances by having 1, 2, or 3 soldiers try to sneak into no man's land, find a hiding place, and then see what happens. However, a soldier in a particular area does not meaningfully put it under Russian control. The problem arises when, at the end of the day, someone coding map data has to make a determination about how to divide the line. If you go by whoever was there last, then you get more fluid line changes. But if you give the status quo controller the benefit of the doubt, then a slight incursion will not change the line. These coding rules then determine exactly what the territorial exchange figures look like, which is why you can see a lot of variation in them, even when their coders agree on what is actually happening on the ground. Nonetheless, the criticism that Ukraine is making phantom gains is missing the point and not fully following the evidence. Russia advances by pushing outward and then trying to bring in reinforcements. If Ukraine is recovering all of the locations where Russia is trying to push out, we must still conclude that the Russian offensive is coming to an end. And while it may have been reasonable to think that was driving the data back in March, the 259 square kilometers in May needs a deeper explanation than that. Something has changed on the ground, and we need to start understanding what. Well, actually, many things have changed on the ground. But let's ironically start with what is mostly up in the air: the weather. I am sure you know the basics of this story by now. Moisture is bad for getting heavy vehicles into position. And despite drones dominating the front line, and small infiltration groups being the new norm, mechanized groups can still take advantage of gaps, and everyone needs to be resupplied regardless. This winter was colder and had more precipitation than the previous year. That meant substantially more snowfall. Come March, that snow began to melt, setting up a particularly bad Rasputitsa mud season for the spring. Hence, Russia's offensive got bogged down. Okay, sure, but do you see the inconsistency with this theory and the data? Ukraine is now advancing. The Rasputitsa argument would predict a frozen front line, not a reversal in fortune. It is perfectly reasonable to think that thawing ground helped stall Russia's pace, but we need another theory to fully explain the data. Next up is the tree line. I love this image of Ukraine, not only because it is beautiful, but also because it explains how the country got its flag. There is something else hiding in the distance, though: a tree line. The technical term for this is actually a windbreak. Windbreaks help control soil erosion, which would otherwise kill Ukraine's status as the breadbasket of Europe. One downside: advancing troops can use them as cover to hide from drones. Yes, the implication here is that a Stalin-era agricultural policy is now helping Russian troops conquer Ukraine. Except there are some whispers that Ukraine has aggressively started to burn down those tree lines, thereby forcing Russian troops to advance on the open steppe. Now, the extent of this policy is unclear, but either way, we still hit the same logical gap as before. Burn trees should stop the flow of Russian troops. Okay, check. But it would actually make it more difficult for Ukraine to advance through sections of no man's land that it has better control over. Not a check. We still need another theory to fully explain the reversal in the data. Third, we have Starlink. You have probably heard the story here before as well. Starlink cracked down on Russian troops using terminals inside of Ukraine, thereby shutting down one of the primary methods they had to coordinate assaults, and, later, defense. When the shutdown happened in February, we all began anticipating that Russian gains would take a hit. The key question was whether this would be a temporary blip or the effect would be sustained. Well, it is still hard to suggest that the continued loss of Starlink is leading to Ukraine's noteworthy gains months later. However, Russia does not expect a true replacement to come online until 2027, making one wonder why the Kremlin did not take this vulnerability more seriously 4 years ago. For now, though, Russia faces increased command and control problems. It is reasonable to think that this was the first domino that allowed Ukraine to accomplish much more. Fourth, we turn to Telegram. This is a double whammy. Around the same time that Russia lost Starlink, the Kremlin began throttling Telegram. This was a political move. Just like any other social media channel, Telegram can spread the word of citizen dissatisfaction with the government, and, worse, can coordinate protesters to get out on the streets. One slight problem: Russian troops also use Telegram to coordinate activities. So, at the same time that the invaders struggled to access the internet, they also did not know where to go to communicate with each other once they got online. What makes this facet of Ukraine's offensive interesting is that it could turn into a vicious cycle for Russia. The worse the battlefield looks for Russia, the more dissatisfaction there will be among citizens. But the more dissatisfaction there is among citizens, the more incentive the Kremlin has to impose further restrictions on social media. And then we arrive back at the start. The more restrictions there are on social media, the worse the battlefield will look for Russia. Fifth, we jump to railway strikes. From my perspective, this is where things start to get interesting. We might be seeing a fundamental change in how Ukraine is conducting the war. If we can take a step away from the main conversation for a second, NATO's plan to defeat Russia has always centered on destroying Russian supply lines. Whatever is happening on the literal front is irrelevant if those troops cannot get further provisions and ammunition. Heck, Russian gains on the front lines ironically makes the supply problem worse, so you just starve them out and eventually win by default. Ukraine's problem with duplicating this strategy is that you have to project power many kilometers behind the front line. Historically speaking, that has been an ability reserved for the most powerful of countries. Of course, Ukraine has struck targets of opportunity like that for the last 4 years, but these have been ad hoc hits rather than snapshots from a sustainable campaign. Well, maybe that is no longer the case. The tempo of railway strikes and other logistical targeting has increased over the last few months. How Ukraine has made that happen is unclear. Obviously, the answer is drones to some degree. One guess is that Ukraine cut Russia's edge in fiber optic drones, reversing a problem that had allowed Russia to better pressure the gray zone. But in any case, Ukraine has figured out a way to penetrate drones much deeper into Russian-held territory, and that is starting to make a difference on the front lines. Sixth is the extension of that: strikes to Russia's defense industrial base. Rather than striking the logistics, you could just destroy Russia's factories. If your opponent cannot build weapons, then your opponent cannot fire weapons. The barrier to this strategy from before is that weapons factories are generally very far away from the front and in relatively protected buildings. Consequently, To succeed with this strategy, you need large payloads that can travel long distances and evade air defenses. Well, Russian air defenses have slowly been crumbling for almost a year now. Meanwhile, Ukraine's love affair with pink birds has created a long-range, high-ish yield weapon that is appropriate for striking a factory. What we cannot definitively determine here is the extent of the effect. Russian citizens are less inclined to offer free battle damage assessments when one of those factories gets hit, because the explosions are not as dramatic as another type of target. Speaking of which, 7th is strikes to Russia's oil infrastructure. This is another category that you do not need a long explanation from me to understand. Kyiv wants to treat Russia like a gas station masquerading as a country, and the Kremlin is struggling to offer a retort. I cannot stress this enough. The entire war has become the Kremlin's biggest financial project since the fall of the Soviet Union. It will be won or lost based on the balance sheets, how much money is coming into the Kremlin's coffers, and how much is going out to pay for soldiers. Striking Russia's oil infrastructure, refineries, ports, and Shadow Fleet tankers takes care of the input side of the equation. Because Russian air defenses are so poor, this strategy has been working for months now, and it still seems to only be getting worse for the Kremlin. Russian refinery capacity dropped to a 16-year low in April. Accordingly, the Kremlin is having to scale back on its recruitment efforts. The Ministry of Defense only hit about 70% of its recruitment goal for the first quarter of 2026. Partially as a consequence, Russia now recruits fewer soldiers than it loses on the battlefield. Again, Ukraine is taking advantage of that. Finally, we have increased attrition of Russian soldiers. This is the other half of the equation. Russia could still see net gains in soldiers even at reduced recruitment rates, if the attrition rate was not bad. But it is. Again, some of this seems to be how Ukraine is winning the battle for drone supremacy. The other half is Russia's overall strategic posture. Military Strategy 101 teaches you that an invading army needs significantly more manpower than a defending army. A corollary to that is if you keep acting like an invading army, but do not have the personnel to back it up, you will just lose more and more soldiers over time, and not gain much ground to show for it. This is a word of caution about overinterpreting the territorial exchange statistics. The more that Ukraine's gains are the result of drone control, the better Ukraine's future prospects are to continue the flow in its desired direction. The more that this is a product of Russia not adopting the appropriate strategy to match its recruitment capacity, the worse Ukraine's future prospects are. I will note here, however, that it has previously taken a long time for battlefield realities to filter up to the Kremlin's decision-makers, so it is fully possible that Ukraine could continue to exploit Russia's vulnerability for months on end. And that is a good note to transition the conversation to what these factors overall tell us about the medium-term trajectory of the war. As a starting point, it is worth putting May's exchange figures in context. In September 2022, Ukraine regained about 6,000 square kilometers of territory. In contrast, what we have seen over the last few months might be best described as a combination of localized counterattacks, perhaps leading to an occasional theater-level dilemma for Russia. We are not at the scale of maneuver warfare, which is what defined the fall 2022 counteroffensive. While we wait to see if Ukraine can accelerate its pace of gains, one thing is clear. The offensive campaign has given Ukraine time to solidify its defensive lines in the Donbass. Obviously, the first-order effect here is that Russia will have a harder time gaining territory if it regains the initiative. However, the more subtle effect is that it can give Ukraine more confidence to take risks on the offensive. The defensive line essentially acts as an insurance policy, mitigating the downside risk of offensive operations going completely wrong. This was, in fact, one of the primary problems with Ukraine's aborted 2023 offensive. Kyiv never fully committed to it, because there was not much of a backstop if it turned into a disaster. The final thing worth pointing out here is that Ukraine's offensive ought to reduce the bargaining frictions that remain in the war. Russia will not be able to plausibly demand the remainder of the Donbass if there is no clear path forward for Russia to militarily take the Donbass. That is true both if Russia lacks the initiative and if Ukraine has firmer defensive lines behind it. In turn, Ukraine's domino problem goes away. That is, Ukraine need not worry about giving up the Donbass, resulting in further losses, if it never has to knock over that first domino. Along the same lines, sustained Ukrainian operations should bridge any gap that remains in the party's beliefs about what the ultimate outcome of the war will look like. Whether any of this actually leads to a settlement, of course, is another story. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? There is real change in what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. Many explanations for what is happening only tell us why Russia has slowed, and not why there has been an outright reversal in the offensive fortunes. Long-running efforts from Ukraine to control the skies locally and afar appear to be the main drivers of the gains, with further tactical and strategic benefits flowing from that. And while the situation is reassuring for Ukraine, it should come with a healthy level of caution that a good 3 months does not guarantee a good 2026. Meanwhile, if you want a good 3 months of viewing, I personally have been going for almost 3 months straight at this point. But there is still a lot to talk about, so I will probably see you tomorrow. For now, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.